Welcome to Cinema 4D Basecamp and welcome to Orientation Week. This video is going to be all about building up your 3D muscle memory so that you can get a good feel for navigating and manipulating objects in 3D space. What I want to do is by the end of this video for you to be so comfortable inside of Cinema 4D and 3D space that next time you open up Cinema 4D, you bust down the door and walk in like you own the joint, all right? So let's go ahead and jump into our Cinema 4D interface and check it out. All right, so you're looking at all these buttons and you might be a little overwhelmed, and that's totally okay. This was overwhelming to me at first as well. But the one thing you should keep in mind is that just like with any other tool, you're never going to use every single thing inside of it. Just like in After Effects, you have that massive effects menu. How many of those effects do you actually use? So Cinema 4D is like a toolbox filled with a bunch of tools, but just like my toolbox at home, I only use my hammer and my screwdriver, and that does 99% of the jobs that I need to do around the house. It's very similar in Cinema 4D, where you can get by just knowing about 10% of it and just enough to get the jobs done that you do, and you're completely fine. Now, I've been using Cinema 4D for about 10 years, and I probably only have touched 15% of it. So it's totally okay. You don't need to learn everything. We're going to be teaching you the things that you need to know to get your job done, okay? So let me just go ahead and show you what we're going to be making today. And it is going to be this nice, pretty little ramen restaurant, because ramen is delicious and there's nothing wrong with that. But basically this was created all with 3D primitive objects. Now what 3D primitive objects are the basic 3D shapes in Cinema 4D, or just 3D in general, okay? So we got our cube, our cone, our cylinder, our sphere, tube, we even got a figure guy, we got a landscape, we got all this fun stuff, all these basic 3D objects to play with. And these are very similar to shape layers in After Effects, where every shape layer in After Effects has its own attributes. So like a circle or a rectangle, and with the rectangle, you can have the little rounded rectangle. And with a star, you can choose how many points you want. Very similar with primitives here. So if I add a cube to my scene, you can see that in my object manager, the cube shows up. So here's where all of our little objects live. And then here is our little attributes of that cube or of our object. So like I was saying, every object, every primitive has its own unique attributes. So with the cube, it's got its X, Y, and Z scale. And I can adjust these by just clicking and dragging on these little arrows and going up and down. And I'm adjusting the size in the X. Similarly, if I delete the cube, I'm just going to hit delete, and I add, say, a cylinder. The cylinder has an object tab as well with its unique attributes like radius, heights, and the different segments. We also have a caps function too. So like I was saying, every object has its own unique properties, all right? So I'm just going to go ahead and hit delete our cylinder. And what we're going to be doing today is, again, building that ramen restaurant. So let's actually start by building the floor. And for the floor, I'm just going to add a cube to my scene. And again, it shows up in our object manager. And you're going to notice a couple things are happening in our viewport that are kind of overlaid onto our cube. The one being our little 3D axis. And if you're used to working in 3D and After Effects, you should be very used to our little X, Y, and Z axes here, okay? And they're color-coded. And if you ever forget what's what, we also have this little lower left icon down here that is also our world coordinates. So we have the world or the scene coordinates, and then we have the actual object level coordinates as well, okay? So green is Y, and that points upwards. We have Z, which is blue, and that points backwards away from us. And then we have X, which is red, and that points over to the right. And again, if you ever forget, we have Y, Z, and X, and their relative colors. So very important to kind of look and just memorize, like, okay, green is up, that's Y, Z, blue, X, red, okay? So that's our little axis. And you can see as I'm kind of farting around here and I just moved it accidentally, what I'm going to do to unmove it is to just hit Command Z, move it back into place. So that's your undo, Command Z. You're going to use that a lot. But we also have, if we hover over each of these little axis arrows, you can see that we're actually highlighting it. And what this means is that if I'm highlighting this and I click and drag, I can actually constrain my object to one direction. And I'll just Command Z and undo that. And I can also do this with the Y, all right, and the Z. So very handy to be able to constrain things along an axis to get pretty precise with your movements. Another thing you're going to notice on your cube are these little dots here, okay? And what these are actually corresponding to the object attributes here. So if I say hover over this little dot here and move this, you can see this is actually moving the size in the X. And you can see that's actually updating the object coordinate here as well. All right, just like if we click and drag on this little dot, that's going in the size Y. And then we also have the Z size here as well. So one thing to note is that while we have our object level size and scaling here, we also have the actual object scale here as well. So just like a shape layer, we have the shape like a rectangle size, but then we actually have that layer scale or position as well. So very similar. We have a scale here in the object tab. We also have a scale here, or just regular geometry object scale here as well. All right. So one thing you're going to notice as we're kind of moving these around, I want to create a floor. So we're going to make this kind of flat here. And one thing you're going to notice as you're using these little dots to manipulate things, we're getting all these crazy, wacky decimal placed numbers, okay? And they drive me nuts. And I'm a little OCD about it. And it's good, and it's actually for a reason. You want to try to round out all these numbers, because say if in what we're going to be doing to build this ramen restaurant is we're going to be aligning things pretty precisely. So if we want a wall to flush up against the floor, we want to align that to 200 centimeters in one direction, not 282.172. That's a lot harder to remember and to actually align in 3D space. So we want to keep things nice and rounded. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag and just select this number here and just type in 200 and hit enter, and that'll just snap to 200. Now for the size and the Y, I'll just put in a value of 10, so it's 10 high. And then for the size and the Z, I'll just hit 200 and hit enter. So now we have a 200 by 200 and a size in the Y of 10 little cube here. And this is our floor. So one thing we're going to do as we're kind of building out this scene is we're going to have a lot of cubes. I'm just telling you right now, we're going to have a lot of cubes in this scene. And just like you don't want layer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 inside of After Effects, you also don't want cube 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in your object manager here, where all of our objects live. So what I'm going to do is name things. That's a very good thing to do. And I'll just double click on my cube to highlight the name, and now I can just type in anything. And so I'm just going to type in floor, hit enter, and now our cube is named floor, so we know what the heck it is. All right, so now what we're going to do is duplicate this to create our roof. Okay, so we have a few different methods of duplicating things. One is to just hit Command C for copy and Command V for paste, and that'll create our new object. And you can see we can move this around. And I'm just going to delete this for now because I'm going to show you another way to duplicate things, and that is within the object manager here. And that is to Command click and drag, and you can see we have this little arrow with a plus sign, and if I'm holding down Command and clicking and dragging, I can move down, and there I just duplicated my floor. Let me delete that one more time. We have one more way to show you how to duplicate things, and that is to Command click and drag within our viewport. And this is actually how I like to duplicate things as I'm modeling and building things. And one thing I like to do is to Command click and drag and also constrain along an axis. So I'm hovering over and selecting my Y-axis here. So I'm Command click And you can see as I hit command, it's got this little square with a little other square. And that's going to tell you that, all right, we're ready to duplicate. And I'm just going to command, click, and drag. And you can see as I'm moving this, I just duplicated a second object. And one thing you can do while you're moving things around is holding the shift key as well. So I'm holding down the command key. If I hold down the shift key, I'm actually constraining to increments of 10. And for an OCD person like me, that's nice. I don't get those crazy, wacky little decimal places there. And what I'm going to do is just move this up to 200 centimeters. So this is going to be 200 centimeters tall. And then I'll just disengage from all of my buttons. And you'll see I just created a floor. Or actually, this is the ceiling, but I created another floor. So let's actually just rename this ceiling. All right, so what I want to do is kind of reposition the objects in my viewport. And to do that, I'm going to need to introduce to you 3 of the most important keyboard shortcuts to help you navigate in 3D space inside of your viewport. And they are the pan, zoom, and orbit tools, keyboard shortcuts. And they are 1, 2, and 3 on your keyboard, okay? So I'm going to hold the 1 key down, and I'm going to pan. That's your pan. I'm going to hold down the 2 key, and this is your zoom, all right? I'm going to hold down the 3 key, and this will be your orbit tool, okay? Now, you don't want to get too out of whack with your orbit because you can totally throw off and lose track of where your original positioning was. And just remember that your default positioning is Y is up, X is to the right, and Z is backwards, because sometimes you can be orbiting for days and days and days and be completely thrown upside down. You can see that Y is down, Z is towards you, and X is still to the right, but you just need to, if you can just get your bearings back and just remember where everything's supposed to be positioned, you're going to be in good shape. So watch yourself when you're orbiting. Don't hurt yourself, okay? So to reiterate, that's 1, hold down the 1 key to pan, 2 to zoom, 3 to orbit, all right? So those are the 3 most important keyboard shortcuts. Commit them to muscle memory. And the more you do this, the more you're not even going to think about what buttons you're pressing. It's going to be automatic, okay? So I always have my hand hovered over that part of the keyboard because I'm always hitting the 1, 2, and 3 keys. Pretty soon, your hand's going to kind of have a mind of its own and just be doing it, okay? So with practice, you're going to get automatic. And just doing those mental reps, you're gonna be synergy with your hand, okay? All right, so we got our ceiling, our floor. Let's go ahead and create some of our walls, all right? So let's go ahead and I'm gonna select my ceiling and I'm gonna command, click, and drag and duplicate that. And let's just move this down, hovering over the Y axis and holding the shift key. And I know that my top cube is at the 200 centimeters in the Y, and my bottom cube or my floor is at 0, so 100 centimeters should be dead center between those two. So this will be my right wall, so I'll just type R and then WALL, so right wall, and this will be positioned right over here. Now, typically, you'd think the logical thing to do would be to rotate this object, and you know, typically you wouldn't be wrong, but in 3D, it's a good habit to be in to keep all of your axis, center, handles, and arrows all consistent. So if I rotated this, and I'm going to introduce a couple more, 3 more shortcut keys here too, and they are the ERT keys, and they're right below and to the right of the 1, 2, 3 keys, okay? And what these are the move, rotation, and scale tools, all right? So E is move, and that's kind of what we've been in this whole entire time, and you can also see the icons up here. So move. R is for rotation. You can see we have our rotation bands, and you can also see that I can hover over and constrain. So there's rotation, and I'm going to Command Z undo that. And just one last one, T for scale. And you can see the scale tools up here, and it's also designated by little cubes instead of arrows on our axes, and that's our scale. So E, move, R, rotation, T, scale. Let's go back to R for rotation. That's what we've been talking about. Well, at least we know those 3 other important shortcut keys. And let's just go and rotate this again, highlighting that axis band and holding the shift key to constrain. Now, if I hit the E key to go back to my move tool and bring up my axis handles here, you can see that Y is no longer facing up. All right. And just like when we're orbiting around all willy-nilly like, our axis points weren't what we're used to seeing. And once we get a lot of objects in our scene, especially when we start animating stuff, you want to be able to animate things in the correct direction, and Y is always up. And when you rotate things, that throws everything out of whack. So if you absolutely can, avoid rotating things if you don't have to. So if I go ahead and just go to my coordinates here, or I can go to my coordinate manager down here and not have to click out of the tab, object tab, I can just zero out that rotation value, hit apply, or just hit enter and reset that rotation. So instead of rotating, what we can actually do is just resize our rectangle here, or our cube here, okay? So I'll just resize this and resize it this way. We know we have the wall thickness of 10 to match the thickness of our ceiling and our floor. And we're just gonna move this over, constraining to increments of 10. And you can see that we're kind of close to getting the correct height to be flush. And I think that's gonna be 210. So I'll just put 210 in there. And let's just make sure we're all flush. And I think so. And this is kind of the benefit of round numbers and keeping things very organized as far as coordinates, because we can line things up, and if it's 100 centimeters wide, we just move that object 100 centimeters and it'll be nice and flush against that wall. All right, so there's our right wall. Let's go ahead, command click and drag, and this will be our left wall. And I'll just shift and click, and I accidentally did that wrong. I have to make sure I'm hovering over my X and then hold shift, and this will constrain. And I know I moved that over 200, and that should be good. And this little intersection here, that's totally fine. We're all good there. Now to create our back wall. All right, so for that, I think what I'm gonna do is just go ahead and command click and drag and duplicate, holding the shift key and duplicating this floor, and rename this back wall. And again, I know I need to make this tall enough. So something like this, and I think if I go to my object tab, that'll be around 210, because when we make thicknesses of rectangles, we're actually scaling out from the center. So a value of 200 is a little bit too short. And if I just move this out, you can see we're not kind of flush there. So I'm just gonna move this all the way back. And again, move this so it's a thickness of 10 in the Z. And here's where some of our alternate camera views or viewport views will come in handy, and I'm going to introduce you to those right now. So just like in After Effects, where if we're working with 3D, we have the 4-up camera view, so like the top, left, right, all that good stuff, we can access those a couple of ways. One is by just clicking this upper right icon here, this little box, and that's going to bring up our 4-up view. Now if you have a mouse with a middle click button, the middle click button will actually bring up your 4-up view as well. And actually, if you hover over any of these views and middle click as well, that'll actually bring up that view full screen. So if I want to go to the top view, just middle click in there, it'll bring up the top view, and middle click again to bring up your 4-up view, okay? So what we want to do is kind of figure out how we can manipulate things in this 4-up view. Now, in addition to using middle mouse clicks, we can also toggle between the different types of views using the F1 through F5 keys as well. So if I hit F1, that'll bring up my perspective. F2 is top, F3 is right, F4 is front, and then F5 is the 4-up view. So some of the keys that I use the most is F1 to bring up the full perspective, and then F5 for my 4-up view, all right? So now with the 4-up view, we can more accurately kind of place and position things, and especially when we have objects in the way, it's always nice to be able to see where things are. So if I bring my back wall, and I think if I do 95, that should be nice and flush. Again, taking into account the 5 increments either way, okay? So that's looking good. And we have a little bit of overlap there. which you can see in the 4-up view, but I think that's okay. We don't really need to worry about that for right now. So there is our back wall. What I want to do now is command click and drag and bring up like a middle wall where our like front door will be to the ramen restaurant. And we'll just bring this forward, and I'll hold shift down just to keep this in increments of 10. You can see that I was just dragging and I have this odd number here. And even if I'm shift clicking here, it's still an odd number. So just keep that in mind. If you start with an odd number, it's gonna, even if you're constraining, it's only moving 10 and keeping those decimals. So let me just make this, like, I'll just actually zero this out so it's just nice and centered there. And so this is like our middle wall, all right? Middle wall. And let's build a table, okay? So we're gonna have a table and some seats and the awning and all that good stuff. So let's go ahead and duplicate the floor here and command click and drag and just kind of position this. And again, this is where like all these views are going to come in handy. Use these little points here to adjust the size of our tabletop. And let's actually rename this cube that's named floor 1 the tabletop, so we know what that cube is. And just utilizing all our views here. And again, we can just round this out once we kind of eyeball how big we want this tabletop to be. So maybe something like that. This is also important because if I'm adjusting this, I can't actually see, you know, this is actually sticking out in my perspective view. It's where I utilize all of my 4 views here where I can see that table is sticking through the wall there, which is probably a health code violation or something, building code violation. So we don't want to do that. So there's our tabletop. Now let's actually get like the main base of our table. So with that, we'll just constrain in the Y and command click and drag and just kind of bring this down. Adjust the little dots here to scale up our cube and just kind of adjust this here. And again, we want like a little lip for our table. So I'll select the table in my view here and scale this down a little bit more. So something like that. And again, it's totally okay if this is kind of intersecting this cube over here because we're not seeing it. Totally fine. And that's our table. So that's just my table. And the tabletop is good to go. All right. So now with the back wall, we're going to make this a stylish, hip restaurant. And the one thing that my wife won't stop talking about since we bought a house is shiplap, because of that Fixer Upper show that is the bane of my existence. But shiplap, if you don't know, is basically a fancy pants word for saying blocks of wood that are against the wall. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to style it, make this a little bit more stylish ramen restaurant, and make some shiplap, or just wood planks on the back wall there so it's hip and trendy, okay? So let's do that. And what we're going to do to create these little planks is just duplicating this middle wall. So command click and drag it along the Z here. And then we'll just kind of scale this down. And maybe we'll make this a scale of like 25 or something like that. Or maybe 20. Make these even thinner boards so you can see there's 1. And we can just, again, it's okay if we're intersecting this back wall here. Totally fine. But what we're going to do now is rename this shiplap. And now we can just go ahead and just start duplicating and making a whole bunch of these. So we're going to want to constrain this in the Y because we want them to all align on the Y. So I'll make sure I'm hovering over the Y-axis handle here, holding the command and clicking shift and command, click and dragging and holding shift to constrain. And I'm just going to move this up 20 centimeters and I'm going to do it again. And I'm just kind of command, click and dragging, holding shift and making a whole bunch of these guys. You can see them all building up there. And let's just bring one down here, holding command, clicking and dragging and holding shift, doing it again and again. So building up that repetition, getting that muscle memory with the command, click and drag, and then holding shift. And we made a whole bunch of these, all right? The one thing to notice is that we have a gap right up here, and you really can't tell because of the way we're looking at this. And one thing that kind of helps you when you're kind of positioning things is to use a different display mode. And we have a bunch of different display modes if we just click the display button here. And this is our default just basic shading mode, 3D shading mode, but we can also view it with lines by choosing this lines mode. Now you can see all of the lines or edges of all of our cubes here. And this more helps us see more all of these different cubes that are in our scene. So one thing we can notice is that we have this gap here. So all I'm going to do is hold down Shift and then click to the very top of where I want to select these objects, and I'll select all the objects in between. Or I can just go ahead and click and drag in the object manager. This will make a rectangle selection, and I can just move these up. All right, so something like that. And actually can ensure that this axis center is at 100 centimeters even if I just click in the attribute manager 100 centimeters, because what this is actually giving me by selecting multiple objects, I have all these individual axis handles here, but I have the one big daddy main group axis center that is the center of all the objects as a whole. And I can actually align that to 100 centimeters, hit 100, and then hit enter. And now you can see that all those objects, they're now aligned dead center to 100 centimeters. So it's nice and neat. And right now you can see that even though we see the edges, if I turn the lines off, these are just like so accurately placed that they're flush, all right? So to make some little gaps in there, we're gonna go and select all of the objects. So again, selecting the first object in our list and then holding Shift and selecting the top of whatever, or the last object in that list. And then I can just size these a little bit. So maybe bring that down to 18. So now we have some nice little gaps there. Our nice little shiplap is complete and looking very hip and stylish. These little plank boards looking so good. But one thing we're doing now is we just duplicated that shiplap a whole bunch of times, right? And our object manager's kind of getting a little crowded. So what we're going to do now is a little bit of workflow enhancement tips, and that is to keep things organized, keep things grouped together that you don't kind of need to be all out in individual objects. So what we can do is kind of like pre-comping in a way, is just kind of grouping objects together and just collapsing them into one object. And that is grouping into nulls in 3D, all right? So to do that, we're just going to, again, select all of these shiplap objects. We're going to group these together. So to group, I'm going to right click and we get this big old menu, and do not worry about any of all this stuff. We're going to go all the way to the bottom to group objects, or Alt G, and I'm going to select that. And what's going to happen is all of our shiplap cubes are now folded underneath this null. So if I hit this little plus symbol, it's going to untwirl and unfold and show you all the objects underneath that we had grouped under there. Now, this is an option that I know After Effects users have been clamoring for a while, where if you have multiple layers, you want to be able to group them together and collapse them and kind of clean up your timeline, right? Well, same thing in Cinema 4D, only we have it. We've had it for a long time, all right? So we have this null, and we can just, all right, once we do whatever we need to do in here, we can just, boop, collapse that up, and that cleans up our workspace, looking really good. So what we can do now is, again, we want to name what the heck this null is, so I'll just double click, and this will be our shiplap group. All right? So with this too, we can also scale things as well as a group. So say we want to maybe make this taller or skinnier or whatever, we can do that as well using this null objects scale options, okay? So that's, I'm not going to change that, but just so you know that's there. Cool. So I'm sick of rectangles, or I'm sick of cubes, and I'm sure you're sick of cubes as well. So let's go ahead and move on to a different primitive, and let's make some lanterns, okay? So let's go ahead and actually let's first create the overhang for our lantern. So we'll make one more rectangle, or one more cube. Sorry, I know you're excited about spheres, but just one more. So let's just duplicate the ceiling, Command click and drag, and this will be our overhang, or awning, whatever you want to call it. and I'll just move this forward. Okay, just utilizing all my views here and just making this a little bit shorter. And we can have this angled, so I'll hit R to bring up the rotation. And again, constraining to this X rotation here, and just making this a little bit smaller. And here we go. And we can just kind of eyeball this here. The nice thing of moving things in the top, right, and front views is that we can actually constrain to planes of 3D, so 3D planes. So notice how I'm actually constrained if I move this around to the Y and the Z. I cannot actually move this in the X in the right view. And you can actually see that little color-coded angle right here that's kind of showing you like, hey, you can't actually move in this view in the X. And similarly, in this view with the top view, you can't move in the Y or up or down, okay? And that's totally different from just moving all willy-nilly like in the perspective view, which is something you do not want to get in the habit of doing. Because if you look at all of my 4-up views here, and let me just kind of use my pan and zoom tools to position these. Now watch what happens if I just do not utilize the axis handles here and I just move this. Watch how this kind of just diagonally shifts and moves all over the place, and it's totally off whack. It's not lined up with anything. And I'm just going to Command Z and undo that. But just get in the habit. It's totally cool to be able to freeform and move in these different views. That's not perspective, but do not freewheel in the perspective, all right? So here is a little awning, overhang, looking good. Again, just eyeballing that. I think that's looking nice. Maybe that's a little bit too long, so I'll just move that. And there's our little overhang. So now we can hang our little lanterns off of it. So we name that overhang, cool. Let's go and create some spheres. Yay, spheres. So just like I was saying, every primitive object has its own unique attributes to it. So a sphere has a radius and the amount of subdivisions, which you can see if I again bring up my lines. You can see all my little subdivisions here. So what we're going to do is just position this, and again utilizing some of my 4-up views here, and just positioning this in place. Again, these also spheres also have their little handles that you can just drag and adjust the radius and different attributes there. And we'll just kind of move this, scale this, move this up, and this will be hanging off of this little awning here. So what we can do, again, let's make that nice and round, OCD EJ on the prowl. And there we go. Let's rename this lantern. Boop, there we go. And let's create like a string, and then those little top and bottom parts of the lantern that actually have the string attached to it. So for that, we're going to create a brand new primitive, which is a cylinder. And we'll get to know the cylinder now. Again, its own unique attributes. It's got radius, it's got height, it's got caps, it's got slice, it's got all kinds of crazy stuff. But we actually want to align this to our little lantern sphere here. All right. So what I'm doing right now is just kind of eyeballing it. And if we want to be sure that this is dead center aligned to the axis center of our sphere, is to do something similar to when you wanted to do that in After Effects, where you'd have the object you want to align to be pick whipped and parented to the object you want to align that center to. And then all you'd need to do is on that object that you then pick whip to the other one, just zero out all the coordinates to it, all the position that it would then align it up. You can do the same thing in Cinema 4D by building a child-parent relationship between the cylinder and the lantern. And to do that, to make the cylinder a child of the lantern, you just need to pick this up, click and drag, and you'll get this little icon that is an arrow down and then a box. And if we let go of our cursor there, you can see that we just made this a child of the lantern, just like these shiplap cubes are a child of this null. We can also build that child-parent relationship there. So now if I go to my coordinates, I can actually zero this out. And this should now be completely aligned. I actually eyeballed it pretty good, but this will be completely aligned to the sphere. So now if I take this cylinder out though, watch what happens. We now have all these weird values here because that's the global coordinates of that cylinder. If we place this cylinder underneath the lantern, we now have the relative coordinates in relation to that sphere. So we zeroed it out, so it's 0 in relation to the sphere, but in relation to the world, it's actually these crazy values here, the 136095, all right? Or 059. So hopefully that gives you the idea of relative versus like world coordinates, okay? So this is nice and aligned. Let's just rename this middle bit. I can't think of a better name for this part, but that's gonna hold the string. And now I can command click and drag this middle bit and name it string. And then I can just make this super small, and this will be our string, and just move this up. Something like that. And make sure that we're not poking through the overhang there, so we'll just adjust the height of this. And if you want to make this even smaller, I can go into the object properties here, and you can see if I click on these little arrows, they're going in increments of 1, and for an object this small, that's just way too big. So to be able to have fine-tune control of this, I can actually hold down the Alt or Option key and click this arrow up or down, and this will actually adjust this in tenths. So we can more fine-tune this and make this super skinny by just holding the Alt or Option key there. So there's our little string. So now we have our lantern group, okay? So now we can go ahead and group these objects, our lantern objects, by, again, holding Shift and either individually clicking or holding Shift and selecting the first and last, and it'll select all the objects in between. Right-clicking, going all the way down to Group Objects. Again, we can also do Alt-G, and there's our null, and it's got all of our objects underneath it, and this will just be our lantern. Okay, so now let's just create a few different lanterns here, and we'll just duplicate this. So Command click and drag, and again we'll constrain this to increments of 10, and I think a spacing of like 40 is pretty good. So what I can do is just command click and drag again, move that out 40 centimeters, and then I think what I want to do is maybe make another one over here, and I think that's spaced correctly there, and then one last one on the very edge, and I think that's aligned correctly. Again, increments of 10, that really helps. And so there's our 4 lanterns. For this one lantern over here, I actually want this to be a Big Daddy lantern, okay? So a little bit bigger, different style of lantern. So I'm just gonna rename this Big Lantern. And then for this one, I'm gonna actually delete the sphere, because this is gonna be more of like the long cylindrical kind of lanterns. And for that, I'm just gonna duplicate this middle bit, rename it Lantern, and then I can just adjust these little handles here, and to round this out to make it a little bit more of a rounded cylinder, I can go ahead and go to the caps. And what the caps holds is this option called fillet. And what fillet is, if I turn this on, is just a fancy pants way of saying rounding, okay, or beveling. So fillet is like a bevel, and I can adjust the size or the radius of that fillet, and I can also adjust the segments to either smooth this out or make it super chunky. All right. So for 3D objects, especially ones that are far away, you really don't need to pay attention to the segments because they're going to look good anyways. But if you're really zoomed in here, you can see how this is beginning to be a little bit chunky, and that's kind of where you want to pay attention to how many subdivision things has. But we'll get into those concepts a little bit later. So now what we can do is just make this little middle bit part a little bit bigger. And again, we can zero this out and center this by making this a child of the main lantern, going either to the coordinates or just going over to our coordinate manager here and just zeroing out the Y, and that'll be perfectly aligned to the axis center of the lantern. So I can just take that child out from underneath the lantern, and there we go. Cool, so we got our cool little lanterns out front. I can actually move this big lantern over here a little bit more, and maybe even make it bigger by just scaling this whole entire null up. So I can hit T and then scale this up. I can hold the Shift key down as well to constrain it to increments of 10, and then just move this down. And there's our bigger lantern there. And that's looking pretty good. So we got our trendy little lanterns here. Let's go ahead, twirl up our big lantern, and let's create some stools for people to sit on to actually eat some ramen, all right? So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing I want to do is actually create a ground plane for our seats or our stools so they're not just kind of floating in the air. And to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and command click and drag, duplicate the floor. And again, this is where we have all these even values here. I'm just going to shift click and make sure I'm holding on to the y-axis handle and then hit shift and move that down 10 centimeters. And then I'll just go ahead, rename this ground and bring this up to say 400 and 400 in the X and Z. And there's our little ground plane. All right. So now we can build our little stools right out here. So to do that, I'll just create a cylinder. And again, I can use my 4-up views here and just position this stool out here, adjust the handles, and just move this like so. And this will actually, let's just make the stool cushion part, okay? So we'll do that first, move this up, utilizing all the views, seeing how this looks in our perspective. And I think with this, this would be pretty uncomfortable to sit on, just like a hockey puck looking thing. So just like we added some fillet or rounding to our lantern here, we can do the same thing with our stool seat. So let's just rename this stool seat. Go to the caps, check on fillet. Now we got a nice, rounded, comfy little stool seat there. And again, I can adjust this little dot here to adjust the radius of that rounding or the fillet. And there we go. And now we can just create the actual stool pole that's connected to. And I can get rid of the fillet for this and just adjust the stool pole, making sure it almost hits the ground there. Actually, it could intersect with the ground. It's okay because it's being hidden by the other pieces of geometry here. And then I'm just going to make the stool base now by just duplicating the stool seat, command click and drag, stool base, and move this down and hit T for scale and holding shift to constrain to increments of 10, and that's our little base. Now I want to make this kind of rounded, so I'll just move this down. We get that nice rounded bit there. The nice thing about the primitives is just like with shape layers, you have the shape size. So like if you made a circle, it's got its own radius, but then you actually have the layer level size or scale on that layer. Similarly with primitives, you have the radius or scale, radius and height of a cylinder, and then we also have the actual object scale and position and stuff. So with that object stuff, the radius and height intact, I can actually just individually scale this down on the Y to make this a little bit flatter if I so wanted to do that, which I think I do so want to do that. So I'll just do that, and then I'll just scale this up a little bit, move this down so it's a little bit flatter, and then we just got to make sure that this pole is actually connected there. And again, this is when having this side view can show me, okay, that's kind of floating there. I'll just move that down, and it's intersecting a little bit, which is totally fine. But there is our stool there, okay? You can move this down maybe. So we have these three objects. I can just click and drag, get a rectangle selection, and let's just group these together. Again, right click, group objects, rename this stool group. And we want to make another stool here so you can bring a friend to eat some ramen. So I'll just hover over the Y-axis handle here, hold command, click and drag, holding shift now to constrain to increments of 10, and just place it over there, and that's looking good. So we got stool group 1 and the original stool group. Cool. So we got our overhang, we got our lanterns, we got some stools. Now, the only thing that it's missing is, ramen shop, it needs some ramen. So let's go ahead and create some bowls of ramen here. And then we're going to put them right on the table. So let's go ahead and for the bowls, we'll create a sphere. And the sphere has one unique feature, and that is to be able to change the type of sphere that you have. So a lot of this changes the subdivisions, like how they're laid out. But the one we want to worry about is the hemisphere, because that gives us kind of like a bowl shape. And in this instance, I know I said to avoid rotating things that you don't need to rotate at all costs. But for this, we actually need to rotate this 180 degrees so the bowl is facing upright, okay? So I'm just going to hit the R key, and then I'll bring up our rotation bands. And I want to constrain this to this Z rotation. So I'll constrain this using Shift to go 180. And then, whoops, I'll just do that again. So holding the Shift key down, selecting, holding Shift, going 180, and then I'll just move this up. I could also just type in 180 in any of these rotation fields here to do that and flip it. And there's our little bowl. We can shrink this down a little bit. And again, we can also utilize the actual scale on the coordinate tab here to maybe flatten this out a little bit. So maybe just a 0.9 scale on the Y, and make sure this is flush with the tabletop here. So there's our tabletop. We'll just move that there. And there's our bowl. Let's rename this bowl. And then let's fill this with some broth and some good ramen-y goodness. So what we're going to do for that is just fill it up using a disk primitive. And again, we want to center this up, the exact dead center, and line this with the axis center of our bowl. So to do that, instead of eyeballing it, we can again do that parent-child trick where we drag and drop this disk underneath the bowl, and that's where we can zero out its relative coordinates relative to the sphere and just make it unchild that. Bring this down and just adjust the size of this disk so it's not intersecting the sphere, but it's big enough that we have some little broth stuff in there. And there we go. So let's just rename this broth. And now we need our chopsticks to eat the stuff, right? So we'll go ahead and utilize a brand new primitive called cone. And the cool thing about cone is it's got a lot of stuff. It's got a lot of options here. It's got the object tab, it's got caps, it's got slice, slices its dices, it makes julienne fries. And we're going to adjust the bottom and top radiuses here and just kind of scale this to a tiny little chopstick here using the rotation tool here just to place this. And again, this is where really utilizing all of your 4-up views are going to be handy here. Let me just pull this out, and you can see this looks like a pick or something, or a toothpick, and that's not what we want. So one thing we can adjust on the cone is the top radius to flatten out that bottom a little bit. And you can see again, as we're adjusting the arrows here, it's actually going in increments of 1 centimeter. And again, remember, we can use Alt Option to adjust this in increments of 10. So we can make this skinnier down there. And again, this is good for one of those rounded chopsticks. But what if we want one of those like wooden angular chopsticks? We can just go ahead and on the rotation segments that make up the roundness, we can just bring that down and adjust this to, say, 4. So it's got 4 sides. Let's go to our perspective view and see what we did here. And you can see here's a nice little chopstick. All right. So we can just place that. Let's use our 4-up view again so we can place this accurately. So this can be touching the actual bottom of the bowl and the edge of the bowl. And you can see that, oh, we got some intersection there. So let's just move this over. Cool. So there's our chopstick. Let's rename this cone chopstick. And we'll duplicate this, Command, click, and drag, and just move this and hit R for rotation and just rotate this a little bit more, making sure that it's kind of resting on the bowl and not intersecting. Looking good. Cool. And maybe just moving this chopstick so it's not intersecting the other chopstick. Even though we can't see it, it's okay, but just want to make sure we're getting in the habit of checking for that kind of stuff. So there's our one bowl of ramen group. So now what we can do again is holding shift and just selecting all of these objects we want to group, right clicking, going to group object, there's our null, double click on it, and this will be our ramen group. All right, so now we have 2 seats and 1 bowl of ramen. Now I don't like to share my food, I don't know about you, but let's just go ahead and duplicate this bowl of ramen for your friend that's going to come along. So I'm going to command click and drag and constraining this to along the X, and I can hold shift and constrain this in increments of 10. And there's our second bowl of ramen. Now, what I can do so this doesn't look exactly the same is to just slightly rotate some of these chopstick pieces here, and then maybe just rotate the entire bowl here by rotating the actual null. And I'll rotate everything underneath, and then I can reposition this. Now, here's an example of rotating something, and then if I wanted to constrain this along the X, I can't do that anymore because I rotated this X and it's not along the actual world X anymore. So again, there's the difference between local coordinates of your actual object level coordinate and then your global coordinate, which is your world coordinate. So X is always, horizontal, okay? And Y is always vertical. Now, to be able to toggle between world and local coordinates, we have this little button here. So we have the world and the local or object coordinates. Now watch what happens when I hit this button, and the shortcut for this is W. So I'll just click this. Watch what happens to our axis handles here. They actually align to the default that we usually, whenever we create an object, that's the default alignment of our axis handles, right? So now with the world axis activated, we can now move this precisely along the x-axis or the y or the z. And if we had this deactivated and we're using the object level coordinates, that's where we see that rotation value rotate that object's axis, and we can't get that precise movement along the world x. So this is kind of handy to be able to align things perfectly using the world and object axis, again using W to kind of toggle. Sometimes I accidentally hit the W key when I'm hitting E to go to the move tool. So if you ever see this happening, it's because you probably activated the world tool. Just kind of pay attention to that. All right, so there's our second bowl of ramen. Let's add some nice detail to our overhang. So what I want to do is, I've been to some ramen shops, and you have the Japanese kind of clay roof tiles, nice little rounded overhang kind of things. So what I'm going to do is just make a whole bunch of tiles to add some really nice details to this overhang. And you can see that our object manager and even our viewport's getting a little bit unwieldy. We have a lot of objects in here, and it's getting difficult to try to position and kind of work in isolation. So one thing I like to do is to be able to copy an object by hitting Command C and pasting it into a brand new project, and then working on that isolated object in another project. So we're going to do that right now. And the first thing I'm going to do, which I should have done a long time ago, is to save. So you want to save early, save often. Let's just go ahead to File, Save As, and we're just going to save this as Ramen Restaurant. There we go. And since I already have one there, I'll just name it 2. And there we go. We saved it. And now what we want to do is concentrate on this overhang. So I'm going to select the overhang, Command C, go to File, New, and that'll bring up a new project. And then I'll just hit Command V to paste that object from our other project into this one. And now I can start isolating and working on just this overhang and adding roof tiles to it. So what I'm going to do is go to my coordinate tab and just zero out the rotation just for now. So that was like a 24-degree rotation, so I just want to remember that so I can re-rotate it when I'm done placing the tiles. So to create these clay tiles, what I'm going to do is use a tube. And you can see that when I created the tube, it's laying flat. And we actually want to lay this forward. And remember how I say don't rotate unless you absolutely have to? What's really handy is on the tube and on some primitives, we have this orientation option, which you can actually change the orientation of how your object's facing. So we actually don't want this to be laying flat. We actually want this facing towards us or facing the negative z. So if I change the orientation to negative z, the object rotated, but it maintained the default axis orientation, okay? So that's kind of why it's so important. We actually have built-in orientation objects on our primitives, so we don't have to rotate things unnecessarily, okay? So hopefully that's kind of driving home why that's kind of important, not to rotate stuff. So let's go ahead and just position this little tube or our tile, and again, we want to make sure we're using round numbers because we're going to be tiling these tiles and want to be able to space them accurately. So this is now a tube. I mean, it's always been a tube, but it's a tube. It doesn't look like a roof tile. So what we can do is actually utilize the slice option. And if I check that on, you can see it sliced it in half from 0 degrees to 180. And now this is looking more like a nice little roof tile here. So if I just position this like that, I think this, yeah, I saw a little bit of rotation there. So I'm just going to zero that rotation out on our cube. There we go. Now it's laying flat. Just kind of position this here. And let's go to our tube and select some nice even values. So let's select like 3 and 4 for the inner and outer radiuses, or radii. And then for the height, maybe let's do 17, okay? So I'm just gonna move this forward and let's start duplicating and making rows of these tiles. So let me just rename this to tile before I start duplicating and making a bunch of these. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna constrain the duplication along the Z axis. So I'm gonna make sure I highlight that, hold Command, click, and then holding the Shift key. And what I'm gonna do is just constrain this to increments of 10 and just move it 10, all right? So I'm gonna keep moving this 10 centimeters down and duplicating this. And let's go ahead and bring up our shading lines so we can actually see that duplication or the overlaps here. And let's just make one more and see what this looks like. So now what we can do is we have a bunch of overlap tiles. What I'm going to do is select all of my tiles again, either actually for this, we want to not select it with the rectangle selection because that's not going to actually select our objects. It's going to select these tags and we don't want to select the Phong tag. So what I'm going to do is just select this one and then hold Shift and select the top tile, selecting them all. And what I'm going to do is go to the rotation and just rotate these upwards. So they're overlapping a little bit here. And then maybe moving this up just ever so slightly. Actually, let's move it down so it's kind of intersecting the roof there. So what I want to do is go to my right view here and make sure these are kind of overlapping and they're parallel, which it looks like they are. So again, I want to move this kind of forward along the Z, and you can see because we rotated these tiles, our Z is rotated. So this is where we're going to use that world coordinate. Now that Z flattens out, now I can just move this right along the world Z. And now let's go ahead and group these together. So these are all of our tiles. They're all selected. I'm going to right click, go to Group Objects, rename this Tile Group. Or tile row group, because we're going to make a few different rows of these. All right. So now what I want to do is add one other little detail to the tiles, and that is to not just have this hollow end right here. I want to actually have like a little piece of wood or log that all these tiles kind of rest on. So to do that, I'm going to go and just select this first tile, duplicate it, Command click and drag. And we can turn this tile into a piece of wood by just selecting the Object tab and just zeroing out that inner radius, and that effectively makes that a cylinder. And then we can just scale down the outer radius. And again, we can fine tune this either by dragging this little dot here, or by fine tuning this by holding the Alt or Option key and going into increments of tens, and then just moving this out. And again, I still have my world axis selected or activated, I actually want to move this along consistently with the same angle as the tile. So I'll deactivate the world axis mode and just shrink this down. And let's go to our slice and turn off the slice so it's one log. All right, so there's our little log. And let's go ahead, and here's our whole entire tile row. Now we can go and command click and drag and duplicate and make a whole bunch of these. Now I want to make sure, I want to remember how far I'm kind of moving this along. So right now our original tile group is at 0 in X, and we moved it about 7.675, again I hate those odd numbers, but to the right on the X. So if we go up and turn off our garage shading, we want a little bit of overlap here, okay? So I'm just gonna kind of eyeball this and see what looks good and see if a round number of 8 on the X looks okay and has enough overlap. And right there, I don't think we have that much overlap. And again, I just clicked the one tile, and what I meant to do is wanted to click this whole entire group. So just be careful that you're not just selecting the one tile, you're actually selecting the whole entire group. Again, if you just select an object in the scene, that null will actually go to a dark orange, telling you that the object you selected is actually a child of it, okay? So let's just select the whole entire tile group, null, and just kind of eyeball this. And maybe 7.6, even though I hate that it's a weird number, 7.6 is what we want, okay? So to space these evenly, let's actually do 7.5. That's way easier to round, okay? So 6.5. So when we make this new tile group, we're just going to go and duplicate this and then add 7.5 again, okay? So I'm just going to hit Command C and Command V to copy and paste, and then I'll just go ahead and multiply this by 2 and hit apply, and that'll do the math for me. Again, each of these little fields are their own little calculators, which is really nice. And then I'll Command C, Command V again, and multiply this. Actually, for this, I'm just going to add 0.75. So just do a little addition in that little field. And then I'll just keep doing this, command click and drag, and then just add 7.5. And then add 7.5. This is the manual way to do this, of course, but as we get through this course, I'm going to be showing you a lot easier ways to do this, for sure. So this is a little manual, doing a little manual labor here. So 7.5. And now what we can do, I think, is just select all of these and then just command click and drag and just start moving these down the row. And at this point, I don't want to bore you with spacing these out completely even, but we'll just go and fill these out this way. And let's create one more over here. Again, kind of eyeballing it, so at least most of them are aligned. Great. Maybe not all of them. But that's looking pretty good. So we have all these rows of tiles now, okay? So what we're going to do is make this a lot easier on ourselves and just group all these group. We're going to do some group inception and right click and go to group objects, and this is just our tile roof group, all right? So we have our nice tile roof all made. And again, isolating that with our new project, bringing it into our new project was super helpful, because now we can just go ahead, drop that overhang in our tile roof group, select the tile roof group null, Command C, go back to our original composition here, our original project, and then just paste that. And this will actually paste back into the same position as our original overhang. And remember, we have that little rotation value here of, let's just say that's 25. We can just delete the overhang and then just add in that little rotation value here. So let's go and just hit R and just rotate it ever so slightly, and something like that. And maybe move this out and move this down. So something like that. So we don't have any intersection. Our little tiles aren't sticking out the roof or anything like that. We got a really nice tile roof going on. You can see that all of the subdivisions of our tiles are making these super dense meshes to look at. So what I'll do is just turn on garage shading so we just get rid of that, okay? So we're missing one last thing, and that is our ramen sign saying that, hey, this is a ramen restaurant, come on in, eat some tasty ramen. So let's just make a sign. So let's create a cube and just use our 4-up view and position this on top of our awning, okay? So I'm just gonna scale this down using little handles here and positioning this and having this kind of rest right on top of one of these tiles. Making this a little skinnier here. So let's just rename this cube the ramen sign. And again, just like we copied and pasted our overhang and brought it into a new composition to focus on that object there, let's do the same thing here as well. So I'm going to copy the ramen sign, Command C, go to File, New, I'll bring up a new project, Command V to paste that ramen sign in here. And now we can just start working on adding the little letters to our sign. So for the letters, I'm going to basically use cubes like little Legos and spelling out the letters that way. And what I'm going to be doing is I know a little bit of Japanese, so I know how to spell using Japanese characters, okay? So what I'm going to do is go to my front view, and this is going to be useful because, again, remember in certain views, you're constrained to a certain 3D plane. And in this case, I'm constrained to the Y and the X, which is perfect. So I'm going to go and duplicate this ramen sign cube and just rename this ramen text. So I'm just going to scale this down to a size that I think will be good for each little Japanese character. And what I'm going to do is just make sure I pull this forward too. So let's just move this forward a little bit. And again, maybe activating the lines will help here as well to see exactly where that is. Cool. And what I'm going to do, go to my front view again and just start spelling out ramen in Japanese. So this is going to be a nice little workout for remembering the 1, 2, 3 keys to pan and zoom, and then using the ERT for move, rotation, and scale, okay? So let's just move and get to moving and grooving here. I'm just gonna hit the R key and gonna rotate this, and then Command click and drag to rotate this like this. And I'm basically building the character for Ra. Okay, so it looks just like that. Little dash, dash, and then a dash in the top. And then we're going to have a little dash here as well. And then I'm going to, and you can spell this out in English or whatever language you want. I'm just doing being really authentic and writing it in Japanese. So Command click and drag. So that's Ra. And then the symbol for me or me is a little slash or a little X. So I'm going to rotate this, make this a little bit longer, duplicate this, hit the R key, rotate. So it's something like that. So Ra, me, and then N is just a little dash like this. And then another diagonal dash like that. And again, just kind of eyeballing this, making this really quick. Again, you're probably going to want to spend a lot more detail and time and finesse on this. And actually, one thing you just saw that I did right there is there's a difference between clicking R and clicking outside of this circle here. Because if you click within the circle, you're actually rotating unconstrained. Okay, so I'm going to Command Z and undo that. So just kind of, if you're dragging and dragging out here, you're fine. Don't drag in here because it's not going to constrain anymore, okay? So just keep that in mind. Or just highlight this as well. So either highlight or be outside here and you're going to be constrained to that one rotational plane, all right? So there we go. And now what I can do is just kind of reposition all this stuff like this. holding the shift key down and just selecting multiple objects here. Just kind of repositioning things in the object manager here so everything's grouped. And maybe we select all of these objects in here. Let's move the ramen sign down so I don't accidentally select that. And maybe we just hit T to scale all this up so it fills out more of the sign. And again, we can make sure that we're aligned as a group on the dead X0 by going to our coordinates and just zeroing that out. And then as a group, all of these objects will now be aligned to that X. Okay? So I'm just repositioning some of this stuff. Let's see what this looks like in our perspective views and all these other views. Let's actually make this raw up here a little bit more so it's not so close to the border there. Looking good. All right, so let's just go ahead and group all these together. Group objects, and this will be ramen sign. And then we'll just copy Command C, go to our window and go down to that original ramen restaurant file and then just paste. And we'll delete that old cube, that ramen sign without the text. And again, I can turn on my garage shading lines and there's my ramen sign. Now I can go ahead and maybe rotate this so it's rotating down, something like that. So the street level people can see it a little bit better. I think that's looking good. All right, let's go out of our garage shading view, go to our perspective view, and bam! There's our hot and tasty ramen restaurant. Not quite open for business yet because we need to give it a paint job. No one wants to go to a plain gray ramen restaurant. So what we're gonna do is dive into some very, very basic material creation just to add some color to our scene and just how you can apply materials and all that good stuff. So to create a material, we're going to double click in this empty little box down here. This is actually our material manager, okay? And what I'm going to do is just double click in our material manager, and that's going to create a default material. Now, if you double click on this material, it's going to bring up our material editor. So what I'm actually going to do is limit myself to 4 colors. So I'm not spending a lot of time trying to figure out a whole bunch of colors and spending more time on a color palette than I should in other areas. So what we're going to do with our materials is we're going to live in the color channel here, and we're going to turn off the reflectance, which basically has specular and reflection, but we're not going to get into that. We're going to live in the color channel. And basically, this is our preview of what this texture, what this material is going to look like. And right now, it has diffuse shading. And what diffuse shading is shading that gives it the sense of a 3D object. So this little shading right here, that's diffuse shading, okay? So what we want to do to brighten that up a little bit is to introduce the luminance channel. And you can see once I turn that on, it kind of applies like a fill effect that just removes all of that shading that we once had, the 3D diffuse shading. And if we go on this luminance channel and pull back the brightness, you can see we're actually introducing more of that 3D diffuse shading back into our object, but we're having a more brighter color. So let's just rename this white, and I'm just going to command click and drag and create a few other colors. So let's create a red color, and what I'll do to change the color is going to the color channel, clicking the color picker, and then going to the gradient view here, and then I can just more easily find my red color here, so maybe a little salmony red, and click OK. And then what I can do to copy this color to the luminance, because right now the luminance is kind of just whitewashing over the red diffuse, is to click on the color text, right click, go to copy, go to luminance, and then go to that color and right click and paste. And then I'll paste that same color to my luminance. So now I can command click and drag, and let's create a gray color. So I'll go to my color channel and we'll make this kind of like a bluish gray, something like that. And again, right click on the color, go to copy, go to my luminance channel, click on the color here, right click and paste, and that should paste that same gray color. And we'll make one last color and it'll be black. All right. So for this, go to the color channel, and I don't like to ever create completely 100% black because it kind of takes away some of the color correction stuff you can do. So never 100% black, never 100% white, because in real life, there's really no such thing as that either. So just kind of keeping it consistent with reality. So we'll make this kind of just, 15% black, or actually I guess that's like 85% black. And again, we'll copy this color and paste this in the luminance. So it's pretty black, but not quite, all right? So now we can start applying all these materials to our ramen restaurant. So there's a couple ways, or a few ways, that you can apply materials to objects. One is to select a color and just drag and drop this onto the object in your scene. You'll see that as I'm hovering over, we're actually getting these little highlights over these objects. So I can just drag and drop, and then I'll actually apply that to whatever object you just hovered over and applied it to. And you can see that I select this little middle bit part of our lantern that makes this big lantern null dark orange, which tells me that's where the object is. There's my bright yellow middle bit there, and there's our material. This is our texture tag, all right? So we can either apply it this way or drag and drop and apply like a gray material onto our lantern main bit here. Or if we're like, oh, well, actually I want this to be red, we can just replace and drag and drop our red on top of this little texture square and replace that color, which is really great. We can also command click and drag to duplicate this actual texture tag and apply it to another object as well. So that's another way. We can also select multiple objects. So I'm just going to select all the walls, the floor, the back wall here, and maybe that's it. And I have all these objects selected. Let's just say I want to apply gray to those colors. What I can do is right click on the gray and go to apply, and then I'll apply all of those gray textures to all those selected objects, all right? So a few different ways to apply textures, and now we can just go ahead, and one of my favorite ways is just drag and dropping. So let's just apply drag and drop black on the ground. Let's apply some red to the stool tops, and I'll just right click, go to apply, and you can see this is a really good way to apply to objects that are in groups, because typically you'd need to untwirl these, and then with that object active, we can then drag and drop onto there. One thing I want to show you is I have this lantern, okay? Now what happens if I apply black to that null? It actually changes all of the objects underneath it that don't have a texture tag to black. Now, I want the string in that middle bit to be black, but I don't want that lantern sphere to be black. So all I'll do is apply, drag and drop that red material there, and then I'll actually overwrite that parent object, okay, that parent texture tag. So that's looking good. So now what I can do is just select all of these lanterns. So here's a couple of these lanterns here. So these three right here, right click, apply black, and then go, and actually what I could do is just drag and drop. Actually, let's deselect by clicking anywhere in the object manager here and just hovering over and click and dragging. And there, I don't have to twirl down these nulls. I can just apply this in the viewport, which is really cool. So let's go ahead and let's zoom into our ramens and just start drag and dropping some gray for the broth. Let's make these bowls red, and let's make the chopsticks white. So we're just hovering over here. So really nice, easy way to apply textures is just directly in the viewport. One thing I'm going to do is apply, let's apply white to the shiplap group. And then what I'm going to do is this back wall, this middle wall, apply black. So it's a nice little contrast there. Trendy little shiplap backdrop there. So now we can go and apply some materials to our tabletop, our table, our little stool poles, and the bottoms here. And now we can apply some colors to the tile roof. And I'll apply gray, and then I'll apply gray to all of our tiles, which is totally fine. I think what I want to do though for the actual overhang is make that black, again, to add a little bit of contrast. Cool. And I think the only thing we have left is our little sign. So what I'm going to do is just apply black to the entire sign. And then what I can do is just select all of the ramen text objects and apply white to them. So I'll right click, go to apply, and now we have a nice contrast sign going on here. All right, so now we're ready to render. So let's just go ahead and, again, using our 1, 2, and 3 keys, checking out what is the best angle that you like to render this out as, and going ahead and seeing what this will look like. So what we're seeing in our viewport right now actually isn't what this is going to look like when it renders, okay? So to actually see what this looks like when it renders, we're going to click on this render view button, okay? And the shortcut key for that is Command R, as you can see. And as I click that, you can see there's what this is going to look like when it renders. You can see that it applies by default. If you have no background, it's going to apply black. So what we want to do is add just a layer that's a background and apply a color to it. So you can find backgrounds in this little menu here, and I'm just going to apply that. And what I can do is, let's just go ahead and duplicate this black color, double click this, and we'll just rename this BKG. And for this, I'm just going to activate the luminance, so this acts like just a color fill. And I'll apply this to my background. Now, what I can't do is actually see what this looks like again until I hit that render button. And you can see now we have like a slightly less dark black. But what I want to do is actually see what I'm working on and see how it affects the render and what the render is going to look like at all times interactively. So what Cinema 4D has in this little render menu, if I click and hold, is this interactive render region. And this is a really great tool because if I activate that, it makes this little bounding box. And I can resize this. And this is kind of like a low quality preview of what my render is actually going to look like. So in After Effects, what you see is what you get. Like, you don't need to render your view, your comp view, to see what it's actually going to look like. It looks like what it looks like when it renders, right? Not in Cinema 4D. So we got this interactive render view. We have this little triangle here that is actually our quality slider. I can just bring this all the way up so it's nice and anti-aliased there, so we don't have the chunky pixelation anymore. And now I can actually interactively change this background color and maybe lighten this up a little bit. And it's going to actually update in my interactive render view. And let me just turn the brightness all the way up so it's a brighter color. And maybe have like a nice little blue color like this. All right, so that's looking pretty good. And again, I can move this around and that's going to actually update, and it's going to, the interactive render region is going to render that view. So again, this is going to look exactly, this is exactly what it's going to look like when it renders, whatever is showing up in this interactive render region here. And you can see the difference between what's inside the interactive render region and what's outside. We'll just make this boundary completely fill that. And one thing I like to do before I fully go ahead and render this, and it's to turn on one thing. And we have our little render settings button right here. If we click on that, you're going to see a whole lot of settings here. And we actually are going to cover that in another video. So we'll just skip that for now. But one thing I want to turn on is a 3D concept called ambient occlusion. Okay, it's right here. You click Effect, go to ambient occlusion. Watch what happens as our interactive render region updates. It creates this really nice contrast, this really nice shading where objects are kind of touching here. Now, what ambient occlusion is the real world shading that happens in real life, real world, that when two objects are touching each other, it's that shading between the nooks and crannies of those objects. So if I zoom into the tiles here, you can see all that nice ambient occlusion shading happening between those tiles. So what this does, and actually what I'm seeing now, is our little lanterns are kind of going, poking through our objects there, which is nice. So let's go ahead and bring our lanterns down here. Just moving them down so they're not intersecting anymore. Cool. So you pay attention to detail there. Cool. So now we have some really nice shading. It really makes all the details of our ramen restaurant, especially that tiled roof, really pop a lot more, adds that nice contrast, and I think it's looking really, really nice. So we'll cover more about ambient occlusion in later videos, but just, set it and forget it for now, and it just really makes it look that much nicer. So now you can go ahead, set your output path, all that good stuff, render it out, print it out, put it on your refrigerator, and feel really good about yourself because you are now in 3D, my friend, all right? So before I wrap this up, I want to show you how I took this ramen restaurant concept and pushed it a little further. You can see that I added a whole second story to my ramen restaurant, and you can see that it's basically built out of the same elements that I've been showing you how to use and utilize throughout this entire video. It's a bunch of cubes. I duplicated the tiled roof overhang and made it into the second story roof. And you can see that this window is just a bunch of cubes as well as this little menu sign. So you're equipped to kind of push the limits, and if you've been following along and building your own ramen restaurant, definitely add on to it. Improvise maybe your ramen restaurant's 5-story talls. But whatever you do, if you have been following along and you did make a nice little ramen restaurant, share it on the Facebook group, because I really would love to see what you're making and how you're progressing and what kind of ramen restaurant you create. So definitely post it on the Facebook group. I'm sure all the other students would love to see what you're working on as well. All right, so we covered a ton today. We got a little crash course in primitives, how to navigate within a 3D scene, and how to deal with a whole lot of objects. So if you're feeling a little bit uncomfortable, you don't quite grasp all of the concepts that were introduced, I highly recommend you go back, rewatch this video until you are completely comfortable navigating the viewport, using your 4-up views, using all of your shortcut keys. You want to get to the point where using the 1, 2, 3 keys, you're not even thinking about it, okay? It's just second nature. Now, once you feel comfortable, you're going to build a nice, solid foundation that we can start building on top of as you progress through this course. If you keep plowing ahead and you're not quite comfortable, you're gonna have a pretty weak, wobbly foundation. If you start building, everything you build on top is gonna stress that foundation. It's gonna crumble and everything's gonna start falling down like a game of Jenga. And you do not want to be the one that gets Jenga'd, okay? So make sure you're super comfortable with everything that we covered. And again, if you're not, rewatch, no shame in that. But let me just be the first to welcome you to the world of 3D. This next few weeks here in this course are going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be a lot of struggle, but through struggle comes growth. Remember that, okay? So happy 3Ding, and I cannot wait to get started. So let's go.